Decatur's YouTube presentation of innovative housing opportunities in the city of Decatur by our Director of Planning, Angela Threadgill. This presentation is a recording of a third Thursday presentation by the Lifelong Community Board in July 2016. We are doing this recording so as many people as possible can learn about new and creative ways to live in the city of Decatur. Here is Angela.
Thank you so much, Terry. I'm happy to be here to give this presentation about creating opportunities for new housing options in the city of Decatur. So moving on into our slide presentation to slide number 3, we ask, what is a home? And how do each of us define it? Can it be defined beyond these 3 archetypes, which are a detached single family? This is our traditional home. An apartment building or a condominium building, or townhomes. As a measure of how homes are built out today in Decatur, 75% of land uses are residential uses. And of those residential land uses, 91% are traditional detached single-family homes. And 7% are the multifamily homes, mainly near our downtown area, our downtown core. If we move on to slide 5, based on those measures of how Decatur is doing, how we're built out today, we are doing really well in the single family and our stacked flats, apartments, and condominiums. But there's a whole range of other homes that are in that middle, and that's a term called the missing middle housing. These are made up of duplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, carriage houses. These are just to name a few. And these aren't new building types, but over time they've been written out of zoning codes. And this is just not in the city of Decatur, but nationwide this has happened over time where these are no longer permitted in zoning codes. But without a diversity of housing types, we can't expect diversity within our price points and demographics. So that is why, if we move on to slide number 6, that's why in Decatur's 2020 strategic plan, there are several tasks for us to create opportunities for more housing options. And if we take a look here, I've pointed out a few different types that are now permitted by our new Unified Development Ordinance, which is the cottage court, tiny houses, as well as courtyard apartments and cottage court developments. And all this became effective in February of 2015. And so we now are allowing missing middle housing types. So let's take a look at some of these shifts that are happening in Decatur's economic profile, and this is on slide number 7. At first glance, one would conclude that Decatur's area median income is keeping pace with the increasing home prices over this 15-year period. There's been a 63% increase in median household income and a 69% increase in average home prices between 2000 and 2014. However, these numbers are misleading. Moving on to slide number 8, if we take a closer look at the income distribution over that same time of period, you'll see households in the middle income brackets. Those are shaded in purple, green, and red. Those have shrunk 31%, and those are being replaced with a higher income percentage households. So I would like to think that this shift in percentages is because everyone got raises, but that would be naive to think that. And so as a result, Decatur now has a missing middle income. If we move on to slide number 9, Decatur's housing profile reinforces why such a shift in demographics is occurring. So if we take a look at between 2000 and 2014, we have approximately 1,000 new housing units that have been added. And of those new housing units that have been built within the last decade, that have a high median value. That's around $416,000 is the median value of those homes. Those are only attainable by high-income households. So what would be better is to have a balance of price points that are affordable to more income brackets. Moving on to slide number 10, I'm kind of showing the buying power of some of our missing middle income families. So we have the purple family that is making approximately $92,600. That's 120% of our area median income. And if we punch the numbers, what they could afford is around a house value of about $370,000. And going off that known measure, you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your income on housing cost. Their maximum housing costs are around $2,300 a month. And of roughly the 10,000 housing units we have in the city today, less than 1,000 are 3 or more bedrooms that, of this value. And when I was checking, what was on the market, there were only 3 homes in the entire city of Decatur that this particular family would be able to afford. If we move on to the blue family, this is the family that is making the area median income. Their household income is $77,200. What they could afford is $275,000 home, and their maximum housing cost is just under $2,000. And of roughly, our 10,000 dwelling units in the city, less than 500 are 3+ bedroom units of that value. And, on the market, there's only about 2 homes that would be affordable to them within the city of Decatur. Of course, the purple family also, would be able to purchase those. So it kind of creates a little bit of a bidding war and significant supply and demand issues. If we move on to the green family, who earns about 75% of the area median income, which is around $58,000 a year, their maximum housing cost is just under $1,500 for a month, and less than 100 homes in the city of Decatur are of that value, and of course none at this moment are on the market for them to purchase. So these are very significant numbers to consider as we look at creating housing options for our missing middle families that are missing from our demographics. So moving on to slide number 11, we're considering what Decatur's demographics are, what our socioeconomics are, and we look at the policies that we have in place right now. And our policies are all grounded in smart growth planning principles. We want a mix of land uses, compact building design, and that doesn't necessarily mean, everything is apartments or condominiums, but just a little bit denser, and then, of course, to provide a range of housing. Also, diversity is a must. We have heard that many times over in our planning processes, that diversity is key, and that's what our community wants to see. I have mentioned before that Decatur does not value itself or measure itself based on area median income. It values itself on diversity. And of course, we always want a strong sense of community, a strong sense of place. We want walkable neighborhoods. We've received a lot of comments about creating more pocket parks so that more folks can access parks within their own neighborhoods, and creating a variety of transportation options, making sure that our collector streets and have options for pedestrians and bicyclists as well as vehicles. So we have a complete streets philosophy that we're also working on. So with all this in place, I want to show 4 different housing options that are new to Decatur's zoning codes. So if we move on to slide number 12, the first is the cottage court housing type. This is a very exciting housing type that we're looking at. And this type of housing seeks to preserve community character with the detached houses, traditional houses, but with a slightly higher density. There's about 5 to 9 cottages surrounding a shared green space. The maximum square footage is about 1,800 square feet, 1.5 stories high. And all this is very similar to Decatur's older housing stock and perhaps similar to sizes of homes that many American generations have grown up in up until, these recent trends. And then one way to potentially keep this affordable is to look at a community land trust, and I will get into that in a couple of slides here. But if we move on to slide number 13, the cottage court hasn't taken off quite as much as we would like to. So the Decatur Development Authority has purchased a property at 230 Commerce Drive as a way to develop a pilot model for the cottage court. And this site is within a half mile of downtown, a half mile of 2 MARTA stations. And instead of having one 4,000 square foot home, we're looking at creating 6 small cottages. The maximum size being around 1,200 square feet, going down to around 450, 500 square feet. So there's going to be a good mix of homes. The price points are still being determined, so that will be coming out here in the near future as we get those details ironed out. But moving on to slide number 14, to keep this particular cottage court development, this pilot model, affordable, we are looking at establishing a community land trust. And it would maintain the ownership of the land because, as we know, the value, our property taxes are a lot of it based on the value of the land. So if the community land trust maintains ownership, then those property taxes should be fairly low for the owners of those individual cottages. And then we're also looking, as part of the community land trust, having deed restrictions on income eligibility so that those who purchase the cottages, are truly those that fit within those income brackets that I was just showing you, and also to limit profit upon sale so that there's a permanent affordability to these cottages. And if we move on to slide number 15, the next housing type is the accessory dwelling unit. So this seeks to create a housing type that's a bit smaller, and it sits behind the main or primary dwelling unit at the rear of the property. And it can be attached or detached, but for the purposes of my presentation, I'm showing it as a detached structure. It could either be a part of a garage, like a true carriage house, or it could just be a standalone structure, accessory dwelling unit without, being tied into the garage. But some of the parameters of doing an accessory dwelling unit is that it is limited to 40% of the floor area of the principal dwelling, or a maximum of 800 square feet. If it is combined with the garage, the maximum is 1,000 square feet of floor area if it is combined. It can have up to 2 bedrooms, and I think the limitation is 2 persons. However, another thing to consider is that the property owner must reside on the property. So the property must be owner occupied. The owner could live in the accessory dwelling unit and rent out the larger home, or they could remain in the larger home and rent out the accessory dwelling unit. We've seen a lot of popularity among our residents who might want their aging parent to move in with them, and this is another option so that the aging parent still has their own space in the accessory dwelling unit, but yet they're still close to their family. Or if an aging person is in their larger home and they don't want the expense of upkeep, or they just simply don't need that much room, they could look at having an accessory dwelling unit at the rear of the property, have the income from the rental of the larger home, and yet stay within the neighborhood that they've been in for years. So they're not moving on. They're just able to age in place. So if we go on to slide number 16, the next housing is of a tiny size, which we call the tiny house. Decatur's new Unified Development Ordinance has eliminated the minimum floor area. Up until 2015, there was a requirement that new principal dwelling units be a minimum of 1,500 square feet, or about 1,800 square feet, depending on what zoning district you were in. But what we learned is that by requiring minimums, we decreased opportunities to create smaller, affordable homes that are equally desirable and marketable. And one thing that we know is that zoning codes shouldn't exist to price someone out of the community. So that is the reason why our zoning code has changed. So really the only thing that is, limiting the size of a home is the building code, and which provides for a minimum standard of 120 square feet. So that's the minimum size that a home should be. So before I leave slide number 16, I want to point out that a tiny house can be used in different ways. So the first is that a tiny house could be used as an accessory dwelling unit. Okay, so that could be placed behind the principal dwelling unit. And then it could also be clustered together. So you might have several tiny houses clustered together in a cottage court. And then also, if someone would like to, they can also have a tiny house as a principal dwelling unit. Just because we have eliminated those minimum requirements, they can have that as a principal dwelling unit now. And then the last housing type that I wanted to point out is on slide number 17, which is shared living. Previously, Decatur zoning codes limited the number of unrelated persons who could live together under one roof. And this is an old stigma of being a brothel. So, and this is not just Decatur. This, again, was across the nation, and there's been a movement to kind of lift that, because what's happening is that trends are showing older residents, they desire a shared living arrangement. And again, this is a way for them to stay in a community, have a support system right there in their own house, and share in the household cost. And so before, we had a maximum of 3 unrelated persons that were allowed to live in a shared dwelling unit, but now we have lifted it to 4 unrelated persons so that you can join in a shared living arrangement. And so on slide 18, this is a recap of what we've just kind of covered. So under our land use and zoning, we have moved to a form-based code, and we have eliminated minimum floor areas. We have defined desirable housing types in our zoning districts to build up the missing middle. And we continue to explore where cottage courts are allowed. During a planning process, our comprehensive plan, we asked a question about, would you consider a cottage court type being next door? Would you be open to this as a building type within a traditional single-family detached neighborhood? And there was an overwhelming response of yes. So we are going to explore that a little bit more, because right now, cottage court is only permitted in 2 zoning districts. So if there's an opportunity to allow this in some of our traditional zoning districts, then hopefully we can accomplish that and open the doors a little bit more for the cottage court type. The other policy that we have in place is for inclusionary housing. And that is our life cycle dwelling ordinance. We've had it in place since 1998. And what that means is that in our downtown district, right now, developers are able to take advantage of a density bonus. So they can increase the number of units, provided that they make sure that a certain number of those extra units, are affordable and permanently affordable. So, unfortunately, developers haven't quite taken on to that, and only 3 projects since 1998 have taken advantage of that density bonus. So we are exploring why that hasn't taken off, why it hasn't been a successful program, and either tweaking it or making it mandatory that they provide life cycle dwelling units. So more to come on that. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, our community land trust, we are definitely on board for establishing this. It'll probably be in 2017 before we can truly establish it and work out all the details of how it would function. But that's something exciting on the horizon. And of course, with our cottage courts, as the Decatur Development Authority moves through this pilot model, this is a good learning experience for us to see how these zoning codes work, because, as I mentioned, the development community hasn't taken to this just yet, and we're not seeing this come on board, from private developers. And we're starting to see perhaps some of the reasons why as we move through it ourselves. And so we may, tweak that code a little bit based on what we learn, what's working, what isn't working. So thank you so much for having me. I understand that there are some questions.
These are some of the questions that were asked by members of the audience on our July 21st, 2016 presentation by Angela. Here's the first one. What size lot is needed for cottage court development?
Okay. So currently, our zoning code requires that the lot area have a minimum of 22,500 square feet. And that roughly is 150 by 150 lot size. And we have learned that we need to be a little bit more flexible on what lots cottage courts are permitted, because with this particular size, it limits the cottage court housing type a lot.
So that may change in the future as you learn more.
Yes.
Another question is, what is the timeline for the RFQ, request for qualifications, pertaining to the City of Decatur's Community Land Trust for cottage court projects? So what is the timeline to come for people who want to do this? Mm-hmm. Do they have before they can put their proposal in?
Sure. So with the Decatur Development Authority, they are going to request 4 qualifications from builders. The Development Authority will be the developer, and they will want to partner with a builder. So we will be requesting those qualifications, and we're thinking sometime this fall of 2016. Yes.
This is a good, very practical question. Who will take care of the common area in a cottage court development?
Sure. So at least with this pilot model, the common area will be more or less an HOA format.
An HOA means?
A homeowners association.
Thank you.
So each of the cottages are owned by individuals, fee simple, and of course the land is owned by the land trust, and so there will be a shared common area which the owners of those cottages would need to contribute to for maintenance.
And there might be some people who join that homeowners association, other officers that help with all that decisions.
Yes.
Do you need to own 2 lots to build an accessory dwelling unit?
No, you don't. It's actually one lot, so no subdivision needs to take place. The principal dwelling unit and the accessory dwelling unit sit on one lot together.
Do you need a neighbor approval to build an accessory dwelling unit?
So at this moment, our zoning code does not require approval from the neighbor. The only time that a neighbor would be notified is if the construction of the accessory dwelling unit affects a boundary tree that's shared by both neighbors, at which point the boundary tree agreement would need to be signed by both parties. Which brings me to another topic, is that the accessory dwelling unit it has to follow the requirements of our tree ordinance, just like any other construction. So the tree ordinance does apply to the construction of an accessory dwelling unit.
Do all accessory developing units have to be behind a current house?
So the accessory dwelling unit is an accessory structure, and those should be placed behind the principal dwelling unit in the rear yard. However, if there's a certain circumstance, a property owner can request a variance from the zoning code, and that would be reviewed by the Zoning Board of Appeals.
Okay, so there's some options.
There's some options. So it could be placed in front or to the side.
This is a question about, can tiny houses be on wheels in Decatur? Because some of these tiny houses are on wheels.
That is an excellent question. I get that question quite frequently. At this time, the community has expressed that the tiny houses should be on a foundation. So we do not allow tiny houses on wheels at this time, simply because it's defined as a travel trailer, or in the same vein as like an RV. And so that's even treated very differently in the building code as well. So the tiny houses on wheels, if the community expresses an interest to allow that in the future, then we will explore that.
Oh.
But at this time, they should be on a foundation.
Can you take the wheels off of a tiny house and place it on cinder blocks and legally be in the city of Decatur?
Potentially, as long as it meets the building code. And I do know that if the wheels do come off of the tiny house, it'll need to be tied into a foundation, tied into a footing. So potentially, but the building code comes into play.
Now this is the question my husband's interested. What is the minimum lot size for a tiny house? Can you see a big lot with a tiny house on it?
Yes, simply yes. If the market can bear it, sure.
Where are cottage court developments currently possible within the city of Decatur's current zoning rules?
Sure.
Which of those zoning?
So only 2 zoning districts permit cottage courts. That is the RS 17 zoning district as well as the RM 22. And as I mentioned before, there seems to be some support for allowing it in some other zoning districts, which we will start exploring here shortly.
Are you finding any developers currently interested in building cottage court communities in Decatur?
We have been approached by a few developers. However, when they look at the feasibility of the project, for what the property is being sold for, how much it's going to cost, to develop the cottage court, look at our zoning codes, they have shied away. And one thing that I have learned is that it is hard for developers to break out of, the model that they have been used to building, because, they can get in there, quickly build something. They, have kind of a package and approach that they can do. So this is kind of a new building type. This kind of makes them think out of the box, and it may affect their bottom line. So we're trying to look at our zoning codes to make sure that it is not limiting them as they kind of punch their numbers for this new housing type.
So we need some entrepreneurial developers and builders.
Yes.
We're all calling for all entrepreneurial developers. This is the final question. What kind of people does the city of Decatur expect to want to live in cottage court communities? Old people, young people?
All of the above. During our pilot model, we had a charrette, a 3-night charrette, and on the final night, we were able to present it to the larger community, and there were quite a number of different folks that were coming out. We had the empty nesters, we had the young professionals, but those were like the two main groups that came out that evening. But depending on the size of these cottages, we might see, a small family, a couple with, one child, or maybe a single parent with a child or two that would also be interested in the cottage court.
And the city, people who work for the city of Decatur.
That is correct. Yes.
That's all the questions we have, and thank you very much, Angela, and we hope as many people have any questions. Angela is the Director of Planning at the City of Decatur, and I'm sure she will answer them. Thank you. Welcome to the City of